Good morning, Michelle.
Good morning, Stephen.
The government lost a vote in the Senate on Wednesday night over a 4-week waiting period for young people before they could go on to a form of income support. And that in turn had been much reduced from the initial proposal of a 6-month waiting period. Now, Scott Morrison, the relevant minister, was thought to have better negotiating skills with the crossbench than his predecessor, but they didn't seem to work on this occasion. And it makes me ask you, how much realistically can this government get through the Senate now that we're entering that more politicised lead-up year into the next election?
I think it's very much on a case-by-case basis. I do think Scott Morrison is a better negotiator than some others in the government. However, the Senate is still difficult, perhaps a little less difficult, but it is a challenge for the government. And of course, the more revenue it loses, the legislation you referred to, which had a number of other savings measures in it, amounted to $1 billion over the forward estimates. So that's a lot of money not to be able to get through, and the government wants to pay for things like the childcare package out of savings it makes. So the Senate remains an immense challenge, and the budget is not getting any better.
And I might come back to that if I may. But first, also we've seen this week an outbreak of consensus over refugee numbers from Syria. But it seemed to involve the Prime Minister going back on an earlier statement that the overall number of refugees would not be changed, merely the internal quotas. And I'm wondering whether this is the MO, the modus operandi: resist, 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 until the counter-pressure becomes too great, rather than just propose something in the first place in a statesmanlike way.
I think Tony Abbott really didn't read this situation at all realistically. He defaulted initially to his position that the important thing was that boats had been stopped by Australia, and this was a sort of example to the Europeans, and that people elsewhere looked at the Australian situation and took lessons from it. Whereas, of course, this was a completely different situation, and then you had the very heart-rending picture of the small boy who drowned, and there was just this upswell of public opinion in Australia, and very importantly, strong voices on the Liberal side, including Mike Baird, the New South Wales Premier, saying we should be open-hearted, we should be generous. And eventually Tony Abbott caught up with this. He dispatched Peter Dutton to Europe for discussions about what Australia should do, and we got a good outcome of the 12,000 intake. But he didn't get much kudos for this because he seemed to come to it slowly.
Well, it's not going to come cheap. I think the estimates are $600 to $700 million. You've just mentioned that savings of about $1 billion over the forward estimates from social security changes may not come through. If the higher education changes, which we hear are to be represented for a third time, if they don't go through, we're presumably seeing real pressure on next year's budget, bearing in mind there's been a further economic downturn. And I'm wondering what you think about whether there might be an election before the next budget rather than have to go to the polls fairly soon after a very difficult budget.
That's looking forward quite a long way in a situation that I have to say is very volatile. We've got Canning, we've got people's assessment of Tony Abbott's leadership in the next few months, all those things. But going to the question, I think if the government is still trailing significantly, it would be a brave Prime Minister that went to an election, say in March, rather than leaving it to September. Or maybe it would be a rash Prime Minister. So I wouldn't rule it out, but there would also be a lot of pressure to try and fix things up and wait until full term arrived. And also there's the fact that when an election is announced, Treasury and Finance produce an independent assessment of the budget situation. So unlike in some previous decades, what is in the books can't be hidden by the incumbent government. It will come out before the election, regardless of the timing of that election.
Well, Michelle, Canning is coming, and I think we may talk about that next week, but thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Stephen.